Welcome everyone for joining us today for day 4 of the Hispanic Pro Leadership Virtual Summit. I want to thank you for taking the time to sign up to hear the amazing subject matter experts that will be sharing their insight today. I want to take a moment of silence to acknowledge those among us who have lost a loved one to COVID-19, or perhaps you personally are recovering, and also to acknowledge the racial injustices that have affected us all, and that we can hopefully reach a place of healing and mutual respect for one another. So we can take a moment. Thank you. I would like to thank our corporate partners of the Leadership Virtual Summit, the University of Phoenix and US Cellular, for their generous partnership, participation, and more importantly, the dedication to diversity and inclusion. I would like to introduce to you Robert Gabriel. Robert is the campus director for the University of Phoenix here in Chicago, and would like to say a couple of welcoming remarks. Bob?
Thanks, Alfonso. And thanks to all of you who are attending today's webcast. I hope you, your family, and your friends are staying safe and healthy. The University of Phoenix Chicago campus is happy to partner with Hispanic Pro to sponsor today's webcast. We understand that life has been disrupted, that all of us are making major adjustments in how we work and what we focus on. So events like today are just one of many things the university is doing to serve our community. For example, we are offering free video resources on all the topics that have been discussed during this week-long leadership summit. For example, today we're offering a free video on actions speak louder than words when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and equity in the workplace. This will be a great resource for you to view after today's event. If you're interested in checking out these resources, or if you are interested to go back to school, please go to the chat box and you'll see our URL link, and that'll direct you to our website. So be safe, and thank you again for attending today's broadcast.
Thank you, Bob. So I'm grateful that we have everyone participating here today, and I would like to say some opening remarks. The importance of diversity and inclusion in any given organization cannot be overstated. It brings together people with different backgrounds, perspectives, traditions, and ideas, and enriches company culture by ensuring fairness and tolerance. During this time of crisis, no one should live in fear for their life or well-being because of who they are, what they look like, or where they came from. I believe these words should be equally applied to employees who bring differences of thought, vision, culture to the workplace. Differences that should be celebrated by employers, fellow employees, and corporate America. So how can diversity and inclusion give a company or an organization a competitive edge? According to a 2019 workforce study by management consulting firm McKinsey & Co., among the 1,000 large businesses in the study, the top quarter of the businesses indexing high in diversity had 36% higher profitability than the bottom quarter of the companies in the study. In other words, workplace diversity appears to be good for the bottom line. I want to thank our panelists as they represent a distinct set of values and insight that make them leaders in managing diverse and inclusive workforces, and have taken precious time of their busy day to share their insight and knowledge with us today. So let's get started. I would like to introduce our discussion panelists. First, we have Carlos Butler-Vale, who is a Global Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with McDonald's. Carlos, welcome.
Thanks, everybody. So glad to be here. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity to come together to discuss this obviously very important topic.
Thank you. Next, Maribel Duran, who is Managing Director, Equity and Inclusion at the Aspen Institute.
Hola, y muchas gracias, Alfonso, and everybody on the panel, and everybody's watching. I'm really excited to dig in and start talking about this critical issue.
Thank you, Maribel. Next, Salvador Mendoza, who is Vice President, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at NBCUniversal.
Hey, hello, everyone. Live from New York. It is this discussion right now. I'm looking forward to the conversation. As you can see, I'm a Chicago boy, so I'm certainly looking forward to connecting with all of these individuals and and having a true conversation around the issue of equity and inclusion. Thank you for having me, Alfonso.
Thank you, Salvador, for joining us. And Alberto Ortega, who is the Director of Workforce Strategy and Business Engagement for the City of Chicago. Alberto, welcome.
Thank you, Alfonso, and looking forward to contributing to the discussion on diversity and inclusion, also a native from Chicago, South Side.
Awesome. So let's start off with the first question. What do you do and what is the primary function of your position? Let's start with Maribel.
Great. So I actually serve in two roles at the Aspen Institute. The first being the one that you mentioned, Alfonso, is the Managing Director for Equity and Inclusion. And this is the first of its own. So this is the first time that we've created such a role to really drive and be more intentional about the DEI efforts across the 70 plus policy, public, and leadership programs that we have. And we do work across the globe. The other hat that I wear is Chief of Staff is for the Leadership Division, and that is one of the divisions within the Institute, and we have over 23 programs and global fellowships. So I lead the day-to-day management, finance, administration, people, and culture work.
Thank you, Maribel. And Carlos.
Yeah, so if I were to sum up what I do on a day-to-day basis, I run all of our employee business networks for McDonald's Corporation. So we have about close to 100 chapters, if not more, around the world, comprised of a variety of, areas. But since June, I've actually been tapped to lead our global diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy refresh for the entire system. So that includes not just our employees and what we can affect within our own walls, but also our franchisees, our suppliers, our customers, and from a philanthropic standpoint, the communities in which we serve. So as you probably know, McDonald's is the world's second largest employer with 2.2 million employees in over 125 countries. So it's quite a massive undertaking, but I think it's definitely the right time to do that. And I've felt more than extremely fortunate to have the opportunity to lead that work.
Great, thank you, Carlos. This sounds like a big task, but I know that you're up to the challenge.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Salvador.
Yeah, thank you. If you ask me, summarize it is, I always say that I'm a culture change agent. I work on business development for the company. I create change through influence and collaboration. I build brand equity as well, because it is important for us as we work with these communities to build that brand equity of trust in that part of it. And then in the end, I serve as an advocate for our colleagues, either their development, as an advocate for the community, as well as an advocate for the company, and it's not necessarily in that order. So overall, my role is not only internal, but also externally as well.
Great, thank you, Salvador. At NBC, one of my favorite stations, and Telemundo too, so definitely. And Alberto.
Alberto, thank you for the introduction, Alfonso. I very humbled to be able to work for the third largest city in the United States, that being the city of Chicago, in the office of the mayor. I support two deputy mayors, Samir Mayakar for economic and neighborhood development, as well as Sybil Madison for education. And so my role is to help create alignment between stakeholders in the workforce ecosystem to help people get jobs, get prepared to get jobs through education and job training programs, and as well as help match employers to talent, diverse talent in Chicago's communities, with a focus, of course, or through a lens rather, of racial equity to ensure that our investments are making inroads in Black and Brown communities in Chicago. So that means looking at Chicago's south and west sides, but of course throughout the city of Chicago, and ensuring that we call employers to step up and open their doors and allow us to help them find the talent that they need to be able to sell products and services to help stabilize families, individuals, communities in our city of Chicago.
Thank you, Alberto. And I want to start with you for the next question, which is, what does an ideal diverse workplace look like? And we're in the city of Chicago, so Chicago is as diverse as any city in the United States.
I remember seeing that question. I'm like, wow, that's going to be the real good one. So what does a diverse workplace look like? it goes beyond the color of our skin, our culture, what you see on the outside, right? It's really about the ideas that come or emanate from within that truly add value to any workplace, or could, right, wield the potential, because not every workplace is inclusive, diverse, or has a focus on equity. So my answer is just that, looking on the inside and helping cultivate safe places for folks to share their ideas that add value in the private sector, the public sector, and as well as in our communities.
Carlos.
Yeah, I think, I think Alberto spoke, I agree with all the things that he said. I think that, for me, a big test for what a diverse workplace is how small that gap is between being invited and feeling welcomed. And I think that's truly, I think, a test for any organization. I mean, you can diversify, your ranks up and down, you can increase your representation, you can do all these things, but, if there's a gap between being welcomed and being invited and feeling welcome, then I think, that's quite a massive, gap to bridge. And what that looks like is having an opportunity to feel that it's feeling that you have equitable opportunities within your organization. It's seeing an organization that doesn't necessarily prescribe the sort of one size fits all approach, because I do think that unfortunately with DEI, we see a lot of that. We see a lot of, well, let's throw this on the wall and see if it sticks. And hopefully if it works for one group, it will work for everybody else. And it just doesn't work that way. It's not feeling afraid to speak up in a meeting and knowing that your perspective is going to be valued. It's not covering who you are. It's, being able to show up exactly as you are and speak to, and I think if I can speak the same way about my own personal life, even in my corporate world, as I've seen some of my other colleagues do, then I feel we've, bridged that gap a little bit more. So, and I think it evolves too, Alfonso. I think that, the last 3-4 months has shown us that what we thought, for a lot of us D&I practitioners, for what we thought was, many great steps that we had taken forward, obviously it was sort of this like rude awakening for folks that we just hadn't done enough. And so I think we're still uncovering and trying to figure out what that means for people a little bit more, and understand, because this work isn't just one of those like you get there and then you're done, right? Like there's this constant, like, you're climbing up this wall. It's really always trying to figure out, where you can stay ahead in that. And some of that is unknown, but, we have to be ready for it.
Maribel?
Yeah, thank you. I think, Alberto and Carlos, you hit on several points that I would just double down on. For me, it's not just about whether a workplace is diverse. I mean, when I think about ideal, it means to me several things. One is the organization led by values that are explicit and lived by all staff on a day-to-day basis, right? Is it a workplace environment that has diverse staff, including leadership and its board? That also is to me is really, really important. And is it an anti-racist workplace that has explicitly named diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as priorities, and actively works with all staff to integrate it into its DNA? To me, it's about, is it an inclusive, transparent organization that creates the conditions, practices, behaviors, and policies that create a sense of belonging? So to Carlos's point, every member of the team should, not only, be invited, to your point, but also feel welcomed and be seen and valued for being their authentic self. So I think that's super critical. And the last thing I would say is that to me, it's beyond diversity, and it's about inclusion. So are all staff part of a decision-making process? That means that to me, the staff that are closest to the work, those who are impacted by the policies and decisions that are made by leadership, are informing that process and are informing that work. To me, that's a recipe, or the beginnings of what an inclusive workplace looks like.
Great, thank you, Maribel. And Salvador.
That is typically the $1 million question that people keep asking, right? And I always say, you know what it looks like? It looks like it's 50% white, 50% Black, 50% Latino, 50% Asian, 50% American Indian, 50% 2 or more races, 50% people with various abilities, 50% gay, 50% lesbian, 50% transgender. Now, does that equal 100%, right? I don't know. I lost my math somewhere along the way. But at the end of the day, am I being facetious? Absolutely. But I think at the end, when you talk about what Alberto, Maribel, and Carlos mentioned, right, is at the end of the day is I always look at it as to say, do I work in an environment that allows me to bring my Latino-ness to this thing, right? To be able to be my authentic self? Is this an environment that I'm being engaged, not only from what I like and what I talk about, but who I am as a person as well, right? Or am I being somebody that I'm allowed to thrive at my pace, whatever that pace is that I want to be promoted, is not just by title, but also by the responsibilities and the engagement that my bosses allows me to do and coordinate. We talk about, am I being allowed, and I know this is aspirational, am I being allowed to have a purpose as to what I'm doing? I know oftentimes a job is a job or a paycheck is a paycheck, and we can look at it that way. Or am I allowed to find purpose? Am I allowed to be engaged? Am I allowed to be aspirational in terms of what I do? Am I allowed to contribute to my community, right? Does my company, and I'll speak with about NBCUniversal, does my company provide programming? Does my company cover the news, right, in relations to my community? Are they honoring who I am as a person, all right? Somebody who was born in Honduras, moved to Chicago when I was 14, was undocumented. I'll always be an immigrant. I was undocumented at some point in time. I have an accent, right? So is my company reflecting that in the way that they develop characters for shows? Is my company that way in the way that they cover my communities about the stories that cover for us? So that's what I think, that it is a journey, and everybody talked about this, that is not just the destination, that you're there, but rather is how do we adjust to that journey when we mess up? How do we create content in relations to address that, right? So it doesn't happen again and we don't make the same mistake. So I always boil it down to say, am I allowed to bring my Latino-ness to this thing or not? And have that opportunity to do so. And if I feel comfortable, then I know that we're doing the right thing.
Alfonso, yeah, I think, you started off with the McKinsey, with the McKinsey statistic around, 36%, profitability. That's gone up even from the initial time that McKinsey had done it. I think they just recently, released sort of an update. But, one thing that I think, when you ask about like, what does inclusion or diversity look like in the workplace, I would tell you that I think for me, you've got the moral and ethical component of it, but then you also have the business component of it, to your point. And I think that in a great place, I would love to be able to leverage that same diversity, equity, and inclusion to be a strategic growth driver. That's when I will really know and understand that the company is absolutely committed to DEI. And that's, to your point, being able to share perspectives. It's being able to look around you when you're in the office and see other people like you. It's being able to be, led in conversations with leaders that look like you. It's knowing that your customer group, your customer population, your dollars are being cared for or taken into consideration, and that people like you are the ones that are in the room that are making those decisions. And so there are a lot of, I think, implications, when it comes to this stuff. But like, in my mind, I think, and I think everybody here can attest to the fact that this DEI work is both a head and a heart, effort, right? The head part is the part where, we solidly feel that this is the right thing to do. But then the heart part, that's the heart part. And then the head part is really about, driving through strategic growth, making this a strategic growth driver. And I think that in order for it to be successful in the workplace, you need to do both.
Thank you, Carlos. The next question, in your opinion, can employment resource groups, ERGs, remain alive and thrive, most importantly, during the COVID-19 epidemic? I'll start with you, Carlos.
Yeah, so I lead this, as I mentioned, when I started, and I have to tell you, I was like, oh my gosh, am I going to be out of a job when Corona first hit? Because I thought, holy cow, everyone's trying to figure out how they're going to adjust to this new normal. Nobody's got the attention span for it. You know, everyone now, a lot of folks who are working parents or maybe even caretakers, you know, we were asking people to really split and divide their attention. And I'm really happy to report that obviously I'm still working. And actually, it's been better than I ever imagined. Our participation in our virtual programming. So one of the things that we did really quickly was to say we need to pivot. So somebody mentioned earlier when we were talking, you know, this word about pivot, you know, we need to pivot and we need to stop going from what we traditionally do, which was on-site events that we would broadcast, to virtual events that all of us would be basically anywhere in the US and trying to figure out how we plan. So that was the first thing. And then getting folks to that place, I think, was not that difficult. But of course, everybody was scared because it's a lot of work that goes into putting something like this together, putting any type of webinar together. And so I thought, oh my gosh, now people aren't going to show up. Well, we've had participation rates double, if not more. I mean, I have never seen the level of engagement in our employee, we call them employee business networks, but in our employee resource groups as I have right now, to the point where our resource groups are trying to figure out how to really fully take advantage of that. So I think for a number of reasons, first of all, ERGs are really important in perspective for they're great enablers for perspective sharing and for perspective taking. And I think especially after what was happening with George Floyd, I think a lot of folks found themselves in a situation where they were trying to figure out how they can get perspective, but also give perspective. And more than anything, how can they plug into that work? And I think because of that reason, our employee business networks are, you know, really well positioned. And the last thing I'll say is that they're so resilient. I mean, when you talk about resiliency, our employee business networks, I think truly, and they really are the pulse of, I think, the diverse employees in our communities. And so anytime you give them a challenge, they'll typically try to figure out how to meet it and exceed it. And so I absolutely do think and agree that not only can employee resource groups continue to flourish and grow, but actually you have an opportunity to do even more and create better impact.
Thank you, Carlos. Salvador.
So I think that we all agree, I can probably speak for many companies, that if you already had a foundation of employee resource groups in the company, what you have found out over the last 7 months or so is how integral they have been as part of the company, either from a communication perspective, networking perspective, connection perspective, keeping employees engaged side of it. And then you can look at pre-George Floyd and post-George Floyd, right? Pre-George Floyd, they were already engaged. They were pivoting to virtual events. They were connecting, to Carlos's point, doubling on the number of people virtually engaging. And then you see post-George Floyd, it was another element of engagement. It was basically what we saw was the rise of empowerment by our employee resource group and its leaders, in particular our Black Employee Network Group, the empowerment that our employees had and let's use demand right now in the context of a good thing, right? The empowerment of our employee resource group members, in particular, our Black employees, our Black colleagues, the empowerment about demanding changes in the company, about putting together our Black Employee Network Group created, and they are still having these sessions called A Village Talks, that allows basically their membership and allies and everybody else to get together and just have conversations around not only the issues that are happening right now, but it's also how does that relate to the company, the commitment that the company has made, and how do we put an action plan behind it. What I will caution companies that are either going through this search, right, of empowerment is I also lead the employee resource groups for the company. Part of the coaching that I have done to our leaders, our employee resource group leaders, is to say, look, empowerment is a beautiful thing, and I will certainly fuel it. I will continue to provide resources. However, I will caution individuals, and as I coach them as well, is to say, let's make sure that whatever demands we're making of the company comes from the empowerment, right? It comes from that. If it is being fueled from empowerment, and it is not being fueled by entitlement. because there's a fine line between being empowered and being entitled. And if you are having demands of the company that are being fueled by entitlement, we lose a lot of allies. We lose basically momentum. So in this case, the employee resource groups have been an integral part of our action planning and what we do as a company of the engagement. We have seen a surge of our membership since March to now, which I would say has been tremendous, so much so that now Latin America wants to do employee resource groups, other functions want to do employee resource group, Canada wants to do employee resource groups. So we see it more and more in the company as how important they are. So they are thriving.
Maribel.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was having a very similar conversation this morning with some of my colleagues because, to Carlos's point, this work requires evolution. And I'm coming from the nonprofit perspective. I've led affinity groups or policy internal employee groups in the government as well. And so from our perspective, we call them affinity groups, which is slightly different, than ERGs. And so the evolution for us right now is around, do we evolve to an ERG? What does that mean? There definitely has been a spike or a surge, I would say, in the participation in these conversations internally. I've served as co-chair for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council a couple of years ago. And that grew exponentially, and it's grown even more now after the summer. And so I think the questions in front of us right now is, what is the purpose of the ERG? What is the purpose of the affinity group? Is it to hold space for, similar identities, the same identities? Is it to hold safe spaces for us to build community with peers? Or is the organization relying on them to drive the work forward? Which I think is really, really important to define, because we need to also think about compensation. How are we compensating staff members who are taking on this, not only the labor and the work that it entails, but the emotional labor? We all know that this work requires a lot of emotional, investment. It takes a lot to be driving these conversations internally, and it can get pretty emotional. It is traumatizing to have to relive all of the things that are happening in our societies, and to have these conversations internally requires a level of expertise, a level of just commitment. And so I think for us, it's been really important to define our purpose. I think more than ever, they can survive, but they have to be supported by leadership. They have to be compensated in some form, whether it's part of their development as leaders within the organization, in terms of compensation, straightforwardly. But I just think that it's really important for that to happen. It's also really important to think about allyship and what does that look like. So I want us to avoid what I'm calling the glass bowl syndrome, where you have, the other, looking in and sort of perpetuating trauma, where you have, BIPOC employees sharing what's going on, having these spaces, and then others looking in. And that to me is not, helpful either. And so how do we create spaces where people can be invited in and serve as real allies to do this work?
Great, thank you. And Alberto.
Yeah, so I just want to dovetail on what Maribel and others have touched on in terms of what's essential for people of color to feel welcome, right? And I think of three structures, if you will, concepts: opportunities, right? You need opportunity to grow. You need supports, so you need programs, you need pathways. But a critical piece of this, and we tend to focus mostly on mentors, is this notion of sponsors, right? We need people not just to listen to us and offer us feedback constructively. We need people that actually will open doors, who know us, right? Who invite us to tables where decisions are being made, where we also may need to be at. So for me, it's about, are we creating opportunities for people to advance in the workplace? Are we being inclusive, welcoming? Are we also providing those supports and pathways for folks to be able to execute and optimize those opportunities, right? And sponsors, right? We need people, leaders, right, who will open the door for you so that you can also ascend into a role of influence and power and respect, right? And deference to diversity and equity and inclusion.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Alberto. Next question. What is the difference between a diverse workforce and an inclusive work environment? And let's start with, I think, Carlos. Carlos has a big smile.
It's just the way you phrased it. I think, yeah, you said between a diverse workforce and an inclusive environment.
Work environment, yes.
Yeah, when I think of this, in its truest forms, when we talk about a diverse workforce, we really are talking about representation. We're really talking about, having that diversity in multiple elements, including diversity of thought, including ableism, including LGBTQ, including all the 50% that Sal mentioned, right? And then some, right? Because that's just the nature of this game. But and I think a lot of companies in the past were okay with just saying we're a diverse organization because we have women or specifically white women in our ranks. And that's a big no-no. And I know that people, like probably all of us here, have fought to kind of push against that to some extent, because while it's been great that we've seen the majority of these diversity initiatives benefit white women, and certainly has increased diversity in these areas and diverse representation, we don't see the women of color, we don't see the men of color, we don't see all of these other kind of natural and I think important viewpoints. And what happens is that organizations typically like to leverage sort of the lower levels of the organization to bring in that diversity. So you have a lot of diversity at the base, right? If you're looking at this from a pyramid standpoint, that diverse, that base is fairly diverse. But as you continue to move up within that sort of hierarchy in an organization, you see less and less of it. And so to me, when someone says, my company is diverse, I always say, okay, well, show me the makeup, show me the representation makeup of your folks, because if all you're doing is bringing in that diversity at the lower levels, and then you're not giving those folks an opportunity to grow and develop and continue to move on to those very important roles, then you're not really a diverse organization. And I just want to put in there that diversity of thought, I think, is really critical, especially now. We have to really think about thinking of things differently. And I think that's extremely important. The other thing I'll say is, from an inclusive workplace or environment, that's to me totally different, right? So now you've basically gotten to this element of diversity wherever you may be, wherever you may want to be, wherever you may need to be. Now, it's going back to some of those things that we mentioned earlier. Are you feeling heard? Is your perspective being taken? Is your company even targeting your particular demographic that you represent? I mean, some of these companies don't. And sometimes you scratch your head and you think, why not? If you think about, for example, I'm LGBTQ, you think about what we call the pink dollar. I mean, we're talking trillions of dollars out there that we're just leaving on the table because we may not necessarily be, trying to go after those folks. Same thing for Native Americans, you name it, so on and so forth. But I think that that's where that difference of inclusion is. And again, I always say that, like, if you've been invited to the party, inclusion is like inviting you to the dance floor and showing us your moves, like giving you an opportunity to show us your moves. And without that, then I think it's really difficult for people to say, nobody wants to go to a party. First of all, nobody wants to not be invited to a party. We all want to be invited to a party pre-COVID. But then secondly, you don't want to be invited to a party and then not feel that you can participate. You don't want to stand on the sideline, especially us Latinos. We want to be in the middle of that dance floor, having a good time and showing off our moves. And so I think that that's the difference. When you feel that difference, then you're in a more inclusive work environment.
Salvador.
So look, Carlos articulated that already well to that extent. So the only thing that I will ask individuals is when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is one of those things that there's almost a difference without a distinction on it. Quite frankly, on all of those terms, there are nuances to it. I'll just ask people, as Carlos articulated it well, is to pay attention, right, as to what those nuances are and how that applies to your company. Because at the end of the day, I think we all know what being inclusive means. I think we get it. It's like saying, what does being engaged mean? We know what being engaged means. I'll just ask you from a company leader perspective, from a practitioner, is learn those nuances and make sure that you are intentional and you are unapologetic in the way that you advocate for those.
Thank you, Salvador. And I think a lot of times we also know when we're not being engaged, and then it's up to the person, right? Like you said, it's like, do I have the power to say something? You know, is the ERG that I belong to, can I say something? Can my voice be heard? Maribel.
Yeah, I was so ready to jump in because I think about, in the simplest of terms, diversity to me is what does it look like? And inclusion is what does it feel like, right? We can speak to those things. And I will tell you that, I will look at a website if I am looking to partner with someone or hire someone. The first thing I do is look at their website. And if they're telling me we're very diverse, we're very committed to DEI, and their entire staff does not look like me, does not look like my friends, do not look like my community and the community that they're intending to serve. Like, my dollars are not going to go to that, right? And so I think it's super important what we do with the dollars that we have. The other thing too that it's important to remember that this work is not performative. It should not be performative. And if it starts to feel that way, that's where the authenticity is. Like, you should know, and it feels that way, where it's not authentic when it's being engaged because you're being tokenized because they're looking to check a box. And to me, that's the part of that feeling that you get. And the other thing that I was going to tell to Carlos, I mean, you touched on a lot of these topics, but to me, it's like, I'm going to be the host. I'm going to be the DJ. I'm going to be the one hosting the party. I want people to come to my party and not always, wait to be invited, right? And so that those things hardly ever happen sometimes. You mentioned the work that McKinsey did. McKinsey partnered with Lean In, and I think it's doing this annually, where they put out information and they look at exactly that, the women in the workplace, and they've been more intentional about being intersectional, because I think that's really important when we think about our Black women colleagues, our transgender colleagues, Latinas. And so I think for one thing that was really important for me to just, when I was reflecting on the research that they provided, was when you think about leadership and as you get higher up, you were talking about this, Carlos, this pyramid, lots of diversity here. You have lots of diversity in operations sometimes, in HR, in IT sometimes, but then you get into the strategy, you get into leadership positions, and you start seeing that there's less melanin, right? And so what happens is that you have, it starts at the bottom. One of their findings was that women are disadvantaged from the very beginning, where they are less likely to be promoted into a manager position than men are. And so that's when you start seeing the deviation, when you start seeing that less and less, you see less women of color at the top. And so I think you have to start thinking about the pipeline. You have to start thinking about retention. How are you supporting and retaining your BIPOC colleagues? How are you growing that talent? And, Alberto, you talked about sponsorship, and that's spot on. So it's a lot, but, that's the thing that just really resonates with me about what does it feel like?
Yeah, Maribel, I once saw, and I can't remember, I think it might have been a Business Journal article that white males are hired on their promise, and women and minorities, they're evaluated on their performance. And so, and that really stuck to me, because it's like, well, yeah, if that's going to be the case, and that's how upper management sees that, we can do a lot more. Latinos can do a lot more, but we need to be given the chance to show that. And go ahead.
I was going to say, like, building on that, there's two other nuggets that really just sit with me is women are less likely to apply for a job, that they will look at a job description. There's a couple of, there's a ton you can say about how just job descriptions are written with the bias towards masculine, whether they're the words, looking at the language that they use, but women will not apply to a job unless they feel like they have 90 or 100% of the qualifications, whereas men generally will apply for something if they have 40 or 50% of the skills. And so that alone is one thing.
They get the job.
And they get the job. And so the other piece that's really interesting is that women are less likely to receive concrete feedback. It's usually more so in you did a great job, or better luck next time, etc. I'm generalizing here, but men are more likely to receive concrete, tangible feedback about their performance. And again, you're starting to think about when you think about the pipeline, those are all the cracks in the system that we have to address.
Thank you, Maribel. Alberto.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, segueing on what was shared by our fellow panelists and Maribel, this notion of sponsor, and something you said, Alfonso, with respects to give us a chance. I'm all for that, but I firmly believe that we must self-determine, right? Use this like self-agency that we all have we have a voice, and that voice can be amplified by linking up with allies, right? So you mentioned that, Maribel, and working with mentors, with sponsors to make people aware. I remember a story of working with an HR talent acquisition team with respects to finding diverse talent for a new account for a client here in Chicago, a major hospital system. And the words out of that talent acquisition team member's mouth was, "We can't find them. They don't exist." What do you mean? In a city of 2.7, almost 3 million people, you're telling me you can't find people, diverse people? You have to use your voice, right? And I'll make it real. Right now in the city of Chicago, we have an industry of construction, which has historically excluded people of color, specifically Black communities, right? And it's the community's voice that is putting pressure on the city leaders, unions, and it's going to bring about change, right? So I just mentioned that because there's a lot of power in voice. Collective voice, organizing, can get a lot done for positive, right? For positive outcomes, help people enter industries with more earning growth potential, uplifting people, right? Higher on this economic ladder, stabilizing communities. But we should be given, but we should also ask, request. And if that doesn't work, we have to nudge people to do the right thing, which ultimately is going to benefit business, communities, right? Families.
Thank you, Alberto. And I want to start the next question with you. How are corporations and organizations addressing questions about job security or insecurity in today's coronavirus environment?
That's a good question. Can you rephrase that? I'm trying to think. So I'm thinking into the lens of equity, right?
How do we feel secure that our job is going to be there? Unfortunately, going into the next year, this is the time where a lot of layoffs happen because companies don't want to carry that into the next year. How secure are we that our job is going to be there? Like, or is that something that that we can work towards so that we can make ourselves visible, even though, for the most part, we kind of are invisible because we're, everyone's working from home. So how do we get in the line of sight of the people that are the decision makers? When I thought about this question, is that culturally we're not ones to toot our own horn. Culturally, it's not us, but right now I think we have to fight with everything we got so that we do have our job into the next year, and we're not seen as an item that's a cost in the balance sheet for the corporation or an organization that we work for.
Yeah, no, so this is perfect. I'm gonna use a word maybe we could trend in 2021. Here's the framing for it. Everyone was caught off guard by this pandemic. Everyone in this world, everyone is impacted forever, right? Economically, socially, health-wise, of course, right? We have folks that have lost their lives, and some folks that are living with the effects of COVID-19. Given that we had such a focus on doing XYZ, and we just did not anticipate this, it's really forced us to do something new. And that is to be able to swivel, right? 360 degrees. You're walking on this path in life, and you have to add value, right, to your workplace. So how can you swivel 360 and look at your environment in which you're in? So you might be unemployed, underemployed, or still employed. How do you add value to your organization, whether it's public or private sector? How can you add value by leveraging technology, right? to access communities, to deliver messaging around COVID response and promoting public health, adherence to public health guidance, right? Mask up, 6 feet apart, wash your hands, right? How do you add value? You have to swivel 360 and think creatively. Identify your allies, link up with your sponsors to ultimately achieve your mission. So that's my response. We have to be able to swivel and add value.
Hey, Alfonso, if I may, I think to add to what Alberto said is that companies, if you work for a company that is not being transparent and they're not having constant communication about what's going on, not only in their company and their plans about it, or even just from the simple fact that you're working from home and the company has not communicated to you, right? Is to, look, nobody knows, to Alberto's point, this is unprecedented. It's the time that we're in. But I think if your company CEO, if the company leadership is not on a consistent basis and constant basis providing updates to you, and they're not being transparent, either the financials of the company, I think we all know that our companies are suffering at this point in time. But I think at some level, if your company is not communicating consistently, cadence, transparency, there are challenges on that as well, right? Because that is the mark of a company that is attempting to do the right thing. Is also a mark of a company that says, we care about you and we're going to share with you even the hard truths, even layoffs or furloughs or whatever the case may be. They have to be transparent in communicating that. And if your company is not doing it, then there's ways that through employee resource groups, through other mediums, that you can try to communicate that and get that information.
So,
And if I could just add really quickly, I think, at McDonald's, we made a commitment not to do any layoffs. And so far we haven't had any. And I think, Sal is 100% right. I mean, I think it's being transparent around, your aspiration and how you want to, move this forward. Of course, does that make everybody, feel super comfortable? Probably not. There's always going to be folks who are going to wonder, but I think that was an important step. I think the other thing to remember and consider, Alfonso, your question is on point, because the reality is we already know that COVID is significantly impacting negatively Black and Brown communities. And so when you think about the possibility of, compounding the effects of COVID with the potential possibility of also being unemployed or underemployed, I mean, that creates significant challenges, right? I think a few things, if you're look to see if your company's still investing in you, I think that's really important. We've made a commitment to help folks be more agile, because one of the things that we saw really quickly was that, agility, it almost goes hand in hand with resiliency. And so how are we helping our employees become more agile in this workspace? That, I think, the more agile you are, I think the more job security you potentially have. But my next point, and I think this kind of goes to what Sal is saying too, is, and that's part of asking these questions, is, not only is your company investing in you, but are you investing in yourself, right? So I decided, and I think Sal, we're part of the same program, even though we're subject matter experts for DEI, I decided that I wanted to go ahead and take a course with Northwestern so that I could really dig deep in ways that I hadn't before. Not that anyone's asking me to do it, but I want to take that time to invest in myself so that I can be ready and be prepared. And then I want to just touch up on the point that Alberto made about value. I mean, if you are an employee that feels, first of all, that you have an equitable opportunity to provide value, but once you have that equitable opportunity to provide value and you are doing it, I think that's a great way for you to show up your job safety, your job satisfaction. I mean, that's my MO, right? I mean, like, that is literally my mantra in life, is like, where can I add value? And I think that nowadays, especially in this workplace, in the workplace nowadays, it really has to be about what value you're bringing, not only to yourself, to your team, to your function, and then ultimately, obviously, to your company.
Thank you. Maribel.
I was doing a lot of head nodding, but what I want to do is double down on the piece around being transparent. Again, I'm coming from a nonprofit sector. And so for us, the impact is palpable, it's visceral. And so we have to continue fundraising. And so we have to, continue telling the story of our impact and the work that we're doing to bring those, dollars in to be able to fund our programs. And so if we're seeing that there isn't that revenue coming in, I think it's really important for us to have those conversations with our employees early and to bust out the Rolodex. I know I'm aging myself, but to start really having those conversations and making those connections for our team members to say, okay, if there's no position here moving forward, here's what we're going to do for you, and to be supportive and to be compassionate and to be kind, because you want them to serve as ambassadors for you and for the company, after they leave. And so I think that's really important for us to really think through that if, there isn't a runway, that we treat our employees with kindness. I mean, that's to me the bottom line.
And if I may also add to that, to say that even in this environment, it is going to be the differentiator of companies that are truly, look, 2 years from now, we are going to reflect back as employees, right? To say, do I really want to join that company that in 2020, their knee-jerk reaction was to lay off thousands of people, right? Rather than taking care of them. Do I really want to work for that company that in that process, they were not transparent as to what was happening? I think employees, we're not going to forget, right? And we're going to look at those top companies that says, you know what? They did the right thing. Even in laying off people, even in putting people on furlough, they did it in a way that humanized their employees, that let them keep their dignity in a way that they went about that, right? That they provided the resources and mental health support or employee assistance programs as they made the transition throughout all of this process. So we're going to pay attention. I mean, we're keeping tabs as to which companies are doing that, because whatever new normal is out there, right, in 18 months, 24 months, we are going to get to capacity again in a lot of our companies. And we're going to reflect back in 2020 and say, which one were the companies that were doing the right thing by their employees, by the community, in the way that they address this issue.
Great. Thank you, Salvador. And I want to ask one last question. And that is just, what is the most rewarding aspect of your job? Salvador, let's start with you.
You know what? I think exponentially what I have learned about it is that not only in our function, right, that you have learned that the advocates pretty much have doubled down in relations to the work that we do and how they approached it. We also have learned from other business units in a sense as to how they want to approach this issue, but also from my perspective in talking with them is to say, yes, but this is long-term, right? If we're going to establish this relationship, it's not just going to be because of the environment that we're in. But for me, more rewarding is to be in a position, especially as Maribel talked about non-for-profits and funding. I am in a position in the company where I manage our budget in support of external organizations. For me, it has been rewarding that to that extent, I have continued to work in supporting non-for-profit organizations that we know full well need the dollars right now, where we have gone to them and trying to figure out, yes, you pivot, you figure out what to do, but at the same time, I am in a position where we are not cutting funding for them. So that has been rewarding in that sense.
And thank you, Salvador, and thank you for staying strong with that, because like you mentioned, there's so many organizations that need the support, especially in a time like this. Let's see, Alberto.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for the opportunity. The most rewarding aspect of the work that I do centers on jobs, right? And employers finding people to do jobs. And I think of youth who are able to learn responsibility, mothers and fathers who are able to put bread on the table, or gig workers being able to swivel and reskill so that they could find, right, and transition into jobs, right, career pathways that will enable them to live more fuller lives and participate, right, more fully in our society. So for me, that's the most rewarding aspect of the work I do on behalf of the city.
Thank you, Alberto, for everything you do for the city of Chicago. Carlos.
Yeah, I think the most rewarding part for me is also tied to kind of the least fun part of DEI, which is that like constant push. But once if you stay on that path and you continue to move that forward, you start to see the direct impact that it has on people, whether it's a promotion, it's, having someone get a seat at the table, and understanding what that does towards creating more upward mobility, generational wealth. I mean, I think to me, like I that's such an important part of it. Like if you can walk in here and walk out of, whatever it is that you're doing, more prepared to support yourself, more prepared to support your family, I think that's a job well done. And so again, the us folks in DEI have to be very persistent. And it sometimes can be pretty exhausting, but I think that once you see, especially depending on where you are in the organization or how big your organization is, but once you see and understand the both direct and indirect impact of what you're pushing for it makes all of it worth it.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And Maribel.
Yeah, I always appreciate these questions because for me, it's an opportunity to do a little bit of reflection. I was mentioning to you all before we went live that I grew up in Little Village. I'm from La Villita, and my journey was non-linear. It was non-traditional. I'm a former teen mom, and have never in my life imagined that I would be working for the White House, that I would be working with the Aspen Institute and doing the work that I do now. So for me, what's truly, truly rewarding is to invest in our biggest asset, which is our people, right? If you really believe in them, if you value and see them and you develop and invest in them, you can't go wrong, and I truly, truly believe in servant leadership. And so by helping develop and support leaders from across our globe, I think we fundamentally improve our human condition. I think that's so imperative right now more than ever. So that to me, that is what brings me joy and what's most rewarding.
Thank you, Maribel. And I always love people who always say, their roots, and Chicago is such a great city to be from and to be proud that we're from here, because I think it's an amazing city. It's a world-class city. And Salvador, I know Salvador is also he's in New York, but he's a Chicagoan as well. So I love it when people are proud to say where they're from. And Chicago is a great city. And I know that we have people in our audience that are from other parts of this country. So, and with that, I want to thank our discussion panelists. Thank you so much for participating, for sharing your insight and your knowledge with us. I want to thank the University of Phoenix for their support, and also US Cellular and our attendees throughout these 4 days. These webinars will be available next week on the HispanicPro.com website. We had one question from Maria, who said, is it okay if she reaches out through LinkedIn and makes a request?
Absolutely.
Por
There you go,
supuesto.
Maria. You have your go. Let's all be careful and be safe so that we can continue this year, 2020, finish it strong. So take care and thank you.
Thank you, brother
Thank you.
Maribel. Thank you, Carlos, Alberto,
Thanks, everybody.
everyone. Good seeing you.